Today is Sunday, 27th October, and I think it's fair to say, if all of the various reports that we are getting are true, that 26th, 27th October 2024 will come to be seen, once the history of the Ukrainian conflict is written, as a particularly dark 24-hour period in the life of the Ukrainian army. I say if the reports are true, because of course there's always the uncertainties and the doubts. We have all kinds of information that's coming, some of it from Russian sources, some of it from neutral sources, mapping projects like Syriac, and of course some of it also from Ukrainian sources. And the reason why it is likely to be true is that though both Russian and Ukrainian official sources remain fairly quiet about what has happened over the last 24 hours, all sides, all the bloggers, all the mapping projects, all of the various sides, Russian, Ukrainian, and neutral, seem to agree about at least the general contours of what has happened. Now, the big story is that apparently Ukrainian defenses in the two towns, Selidovo and Girnik, or Gornyak, as it is now universally called, Gornyak is its Russian name, that resistance in both of these places has collapsed, and collapsed by all accounts in a most chaotic way. All the various projects appear to agree that the Russians are in control or effective control of both towns. Now, there is some argument about whether there are stragglers, whether there's some isolated groups of Ukrainian soldiers still located on the territory of each of these two towns. But by universal agreement, acknowledgement, if that is indeed the case, then it is only a question of time, a matter of hours rather than days, before these groups of isolated stragglers are rounded up and the Russians obtain secure control of both of these towns. And the thing to say is, it is not just the fact that these two towns have fallen, it is the way they have fallen. A chaotic and sudden collapse of resistance as the Russians closed in from every side, and indications that some Ukrainian troops who were tasked with defending particular positions broke and fled rather than resist the Russians. There is general consensus that these appear to be recently mobilized soldiers rather than the veterans, but whatever. The fact is, they do seem to have broken and fled. And it also seems that in both cases, Ukrainian troops trying to flee both Selidovo and Gornyak, which I will now from now on refer to call Girnik, the Ukrainian soldiers who fled from these two towns had to do so in incredibly difficult conditions, fleeing across fields or roads dominated by Russian drones, Russian patrols operating in all of these places, foot patrols, and of course the Russian artillery and mortar crews and anti-tank guided missile crews all operating in this area, hunting the Ukrainians as they fled. Now, I gather that the escape in both of these places took place early this morning rather than at night. I might be completely wrong about that, so don't assume it is so. But, of course, if it did take place at night, or rather in the day, in the daylight hours, it might in some ways have been less harrowing than if it had happened at night, and there might have been less risk of the fleeing soldiers getting lost, But there's also a higher probability that they would be tracked and hunted down by the Russians. Anyway, it has been an absolute disaster, as I said, if the reports are true. And they appear to be so unanimous that I find it very difficult to believe that they are not true. Now, I said that the two official parties, the Russian military and the Ukrainian military, are not telling us very much about the situation up to this time. So maybe we shouldn't leap to conclusions too hastily. But for what it's worth, the reports also speak of a collapse in the area of the 4 villages that the Ukrainians were defending northwest of Kurahovo. The 4 villages were of one, and the town of Girnik. Girnik has of course now fallen, but that there's been also a collapse there, and the Russian Defense Ministry has today confirmed the capture of one of these villages, which is Izmailovka. So, according to the Russians, they now control Alexandropil. This is the Russian Defense Ministry. Zoryanye, and it seems that they also control Izmailovka as well. So all of these places now apparently under Russian control, according to the Russians. And if I'm correct, if that is all correct, then it seems to me that the only 2 places which the Ukrainians continue to control in this area are the villages of Kurachovka and Vovchenka. And there are reports that the Russians are already advanced into both of these villages, that Russian troops are already fighting inside Kurachovka and Vovchenka. Given how chaotic the Ukrainian defense appears to be becoming, one wonders for how long the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold out in these 2 villages. But it looks as if, one way or the other, this entire pocket of villages, Kurachovka, Vovchenka, Girnik, Zoryanye, Alexandropil, Izmailovka, has now collapsed, or is at least in the process of doing so. And the Russians, by all accounts, have already entered 2 other villages in this general area, Novoselidivka, which lies to the west of Izmailovka, and Novodimitrivka, which lies some distance further to the west, and which is west of Tsukurinye. And that must mean that 2 other villages between these 2 places, Novodimitrivka and Novoselidivka, Kreminaya Balka and Voznesenka, must be in great jeopardy. Yesterday, I said that there were reports that Russian troops had reached the village of Ilinka, which is located right on the banks of the Kurahovo Reservoir, west of Vovchenka. I suspect, thinking about this more, if this report was true, which of course it may or may not have been, this was most likely a reconnaissance group. But of course, if Novoselidivka, Vovchenka, Kurachovka, and all of these places fall, then these 2 villages, Ilinka and Berestki, on the north banks of the Kurahovo Reservoir, are going to be in very serious jeopardy. So, a collapse in Selidovo, a collapse in the area of the 4 villages, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers trapped in both of these places. Many of them are trying to flee across the fields. The Russians have been luring them into along escape routes, where they can be hunted down and either taken prisoner or wounded or killed. And one wonders what would happen to Ukrainian soldiers who are trying to escape on foot and are wounded and left behind in the fields. I mean, I don't want to even think about this. But anyway, it is a tale of disaster. And I think that there is no other word to describe it. Now, further south, south of the Kurakovo Reservoir, south of Kurakovo itself, the situation is also extremely dramatic because we got reports late last night, and again, I can't definitely confirm that these reports are true, but I have heard that there's been flag-raising ceremonies in the village in question, which is Bohoyavlenka. Anyway, the reports yesterday that Bohoyavlenka has either been captured or is about to be captured. That the Russians have reached the central part of Bohoyavlenka and have raised their flag there. That the Russians have also captured the village of Shakhtarske, which lies to the west, north of the village of Zolota Niva, which the Russians captured some time ago, but that Shakhtarska is now under full Russian control. And there's also reports that the Russian troops have reached the outskirts of the village of Novoukrayinka, which lies between Shakhtarska and Bohoyavlenka, and that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from Novoukrayinka. In other words, the front lines south of the Kurakovo Reservoir are also crumbling. Shakhtarska, Novoukrayinka, Bohoyavlenka have fallen or are falling. Maybe that's a more accurate way of describing it. There continues to be heavy fighting, apparently, for Katerinovka, even though the 79th Brigade said a couple of days ago that they'd actually abandoned that village. But to be clear, if Bohoyavlenka has fallen and Shakhtarska has fallen and Novoukrayinka has fallen, well, the Russians now would be in a position to capture these other villages, as well as Katerinovka, which, if there's still resistance going on there, it can't be going on for very long. But anyway, alongside Katerinovka, villages like Antonivka, Yelizavetivka, Ilinka, Ganivka, Uspenivka, Konstantinopolska, a string of villages, a line of villages, and then north of this line of villages, which could form, in theory, a defense line, but I wonder how heavily fortified they are. North of these villages, essentially, there's just two inhabited places, Danye and Dachnie. Danye, immediately to the south of Kurakovo, Dachnie, immediately to the west of Kurakovo. So, if the Russians capture Novoukrayinka, Shakhtarska, and Bohoyavlenka, and if they go on to capture not just Katerinovka, but all of these other villages, the way is open for an encirclement of Kurakovo itself to begin. Now, there are said to be a significant number of Ukrainian troops in Kurakovo, though what they're doing there now, I really cannot imagine. It seems to me that anybody who can look at the map and can see how events are developing in this part of the battlefield would come to the conclusion that the faster these troops are withdrawn from Kurakovo, the better it would be, just to say. But anyway, there are still said to be lots of Ukrainian troops in Kurakovo. Given the speed of events, as I said, definitely the Ukrainians, in my opinion, especially now that Selidovo has fallen, and especially given that the Russians will soon be in control of the north banks of the Kurakovo Reservoir, the Ukrainians ought to withdraw from Kurakovo quickly. The whole southwest territory of Donbass, the entire defense system has collapsed, and trying to hold on to isolated segments of it is simply to facilitate the entrapment of the soldiers who are located there. So, anyway, that is the situation today. As I said, a particularly dark day, the last 24 hours, for the Ukrainian army. There are actually commentators, not just on the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side as well, who are talking about their concerns for the entire future of the Ukrainian battle group located in this region, in Karakovo and Selidovo, and roundabout the battle group that had previously been defending places like Ugledar. And I'm not going to try and guess as to its size, by the way. And of course, as I discussed yesterday, there are already Ukrainian officers who are talking about the need to prepare for the fall of Pakrovsk itself and to consider a retreat to the Dnieper and to try to build fortified lines to try to defend the towns of Dnipro and Zaporozhye. And, well, I'm going to say this about Dnipro and Zaporozhye. There are lots of discussions. There's been lots of claims that these places have been fortified heavily already. If you remember, some months ago, I was talking about an iron triangle of cities on the Dnieper River, which are going to be heavily defended and heavily fortified. Except it's very unclear to what extent, if any, this actually seems to have happened. But one way or the other, even if the Russians reach the Dnieper in this area, it would be a disaster for Ukraine. It would be the moment when it started to become clear that the whole of eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, including, I suspect, ultimately the city of Kharkiv and other big places like Poltava, is going to fall, and Zaporozhye itself, is going to fall under Russian control, and that the Russians, like they were in the 17th century, before the union of Ukraine with Russia, the one that was organized by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack nobleman who in the 17th century rebelled against the Poles, all of eastern Ukraine, Ukraine east of the Dnieper, what is sometimes referred to as left bank Ukraine, will once again, as it was, as I said, before the 17th century, have fallen again under Russian control. Now, whether that will be the boundary this time, we will discuss shortly. But anyway, that's perhaps closer, edging closer to that point, and faster perhaps than many people suppose. Now, the way in which this collapse in southwestern Donbass has happened, and the agonized and panicky way in which Ukrainian commanders, and I'm talking about local commanders, are talking about the need to fortify Zaporozhye and Dnipro from the forthcoming Russian offensive against them, the Russian advance to the Dnieper. All of that, to my mind, strongly argues against the premise that what we're seeing here is a methodical, carefully organized, step-by-step withdrawal to the Dnieper, that the Ukrainians have been working gradually to withdraw to the Dnieper, exacting terrible losses upon the Russians in the process. And the idea is eventually to cause the Russian military to lose momentum and to exhaust itself, opening the way, this is what some people say, for a Ukrainian counteroffensive sometime in 2025. I've always found that an absolutely fantastic scenario. But I have to also say that it bears absolutely no relation to what I'm hearing about the actual state of the battlefields. And not just what I'm hearing, but when I say hearing, I'm also reading in various reports from Ukrainian commentators and commanders. On the contrary, one gets reports of a deeply demoralized Ukrainian army. A couple of days ago, I discussed an article in the Daily Telegraph which said that even the fiercest Ukrainian soldiers now long for peace, and which interviewed a particular Ukrainian soldier who admitted that morale was much lower than it had been a year ago. So an increasingly demoralized and worn out and exhausted Ukrainian army, which has endured appalling losses, which is short of equipment, and whose command system, at least in this area of southwestern Donbass, is becoming increasingly fragmented. That coordination between units is sometimes poor. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that sometimes it has completely broken down. So there is no evidence that I can see of this structured, organized withdrawal. What people like the British commentator Mark Galliotti, for example, comfort themselves with. I just see absolutely no evidence of this, unless there's a deception operation being conducted on an absolutely masterful scale, one which is fooling the Ukrainians themselves, Ukrainian commentators themselves, which I can scarcely believe. I just don't see that there is the slightest evidence that things are indeed shaping out in this way. In fact, I'm going to suggest that what we are looking at is a battle in southwestern Donbass, which, far from being an orderly retreat, is more an example of isolated Ukrainian garrisons trying to withstand a Russian tide. If one is familiar with tides, if you've been a walker like me, you are. And by the way, what I say applies to some extent even to tidal waves, not that I've thankfully ever encountered one. But if you encounter tides, what you know is that the water moves very, very, very fast, but it is not, as people imagine with tidal waves, a huge wall of water hurtling towards you at speeds of 100 miles an hour or anything of that kind, 100 meters high and vertically high or anything like that. It's like water, it just flows like a sort of stream or river, powers across the landscape, first isolating and then submerging or sweeping aside everything in its way. And if you've, by the way, seen film of the Fukushima tsunami, tidal wave, you see a good example of how that actually works. So what basically happens is that the Russians now are almost certainly in this part of the Ukrainian battlefronts, we're talking about southwest Donbass, now outnumber the Ukrainians. They outnumber the Ukrainians in men, machines, and of course shells and bombs and drones and all of those things. By their own admission, the Ukrainians lack enough men to be able to fortify the countryside between the towns and villages when they try to set up fortified lines. They don't have enough men to create continuous defense lines. So the Russian tide comes in, it encounters resistance in a place like Selidovo or Ukrainsk or Girnik, it then laps around it gradually, encircles it, and then submerges it. And that's pretty much what happens in a tidal situation. It has an appearance of being irresistible. And of course, if you talk about tides, or certainly tidal waves, well, you can create embankments and things like that to slow or stop the current. But ultimately, you're talking about a body of water, and an army like the Russian is probably not that different. It stops less because these barriers have been created. It stops because the momentum behind the tide itself runs out. Except, of course, with the Russian army, which has been constantly renewed with fresh supplies of men and of reinforcements and fuel and food and machines and shells and all of that sort of thing. There is no logical reason why the momentum should ever fully stop. Sometimes the Russians slow down. As I said, they reach a position which is defended. They lap around it. It takes them time to do that. Sometimes they do run ahead of their supplies and they have to stop or slow down in order for their supply chains, their logistics to be reorganized. The story of maintaining the logistics in this war is a remarkable one, and given the scale of this war, the skill in logistics that both armies have displayed has been remarkable, just saying. But certainly the Russians have proved that they're equal to maintaining logistic supplies for their advancing soldiers. But obviously, every so often, as they outrun their supplies, they have to slow down in order to sort out their logistical situation, and so that they can then advance once more. But overall, there is no basic reason to think this tide that the Russian army is going to stop in this area until it reaches the Dnieper River. Just to say. Or so I have to say it seems to me. Of course, one must never press metaphors too far. There is always human agency. It may be that for his own reasons, President Putin calls it off and stops the Russian advance somewhere short of the Dnieper. I think it is unlikely, but then Putin can pull out surprises. Who knows? Or it could be that the Russian General Staff decides that, having taken Pokrovsk, the Russians need to pivot in a different direction, perhaps northwards towards Kramatorsk. The consensus now is that that's not what's going to happen. But anyway, either way, the initiative is with the Russians and is likely to remain so. And I think that the Russians understand this and see no reason why they should stop, and see no reason why, given that they know that if they did stop, it would be perhaps an opportunity for the Ukrainians to consolidate, reorganize, reinforce to the extent that they can, create fortified lines, and make the problems for the Russians greater than they have been up to now. Now, in my description of how the Russian force is moving westwards in this specific area of southwest Donbass, I want to make it very clear that, of course, that greatly understates, and massively understates, the tactical skill and ingenuity and the courage and the flexibility of the Russian military formations. in every one of these battles, in Selidovo, in Gornyak, in Ukrainsk, in Novogrodovka, in Kurachovo, in Vuhledar, there had to be very complex and difficult tactical decisions made in order to achieve the results that we are now seeing. And in fact, we are seeing a major shift in Russian tactics, whereas in 2022, and to some extent even in the first half of 2023, the Russians sometimes did try direct assaults. They tried several direct assaults, for example, against Vuhledar, none of which succeeded. Starting from the autumn of 2023, the Russian approach became much, much more sophisticated. Rather than attack a place head-on, we see the Russians playing, to change the metaphor completely, what I describe as the checkerboard game, isolating a fortified place like Vuhledar or Selidovo by taking all the neighboring villages and fortified positions until eventually you only have the tree stump left without the branches or the roots. And at that point, the stump, Selidovo, Vuhledar, Avdiivka, or wherever, can simply be knocked over. Several people have pointed out that though the battle for Selidovo began in August, and Russian troops did enter Selidovo, or so it seems to me, several times since August, the major storming operation has taken just under 2 weeks. That the Russians got themselves around 2 weeks into the position where the storming operation for Selidovo could begin, and thereafter the collapse came fast and very suddenly, as it did in Avdiivka, as it did in Novogrodivka, and as it has now done in Selidovo as well. Anyway, there we are. So, lots of things going on elsewhere on the battlefronts, but I would suggest that further north, in places like Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, we are still in that somewhat earlier stage of the war, where the battlefield conditions have now become very fluid and dynamic in southwestern Donbass. In Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, it is still rather like the kind of hard grind which the Russians used to do still in the Bakhmut days. So it's has a rather more, the battle in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar has, in terms of this war, still a rather more old-fashioned feel. Anyway, on the question of what's going on in Toretsk, the journalist, the Russian journalist Pavel Zarubin, had a discussion with none other than President Putin himself. Zarubin is very close to Putin, I should say, one of the journalists that Putin particularly works with particularly closely. Anyway, Zarubin is saying that 70% of Toretsk is now under Russian control. The quotation is, and this is in fact a series of quotations from Zarubin, the fighting is in Toretsk itself, with 1/3 of the town left to be liberated. This part has been fully blocked by our army, which would imply that the Russians have control of the main supply roads. And in fact, we have seen active drone activity on the supply roads leading into Toretsk from Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka further north, though it's clear that the Ukrainians are still able to move some men machines, both into and out of Donetsk. Now, Zarubin says nothing here about the most recent reports that the Ukrainians have either recaptured or retained control of the Zabalka micro-district. I wonder whether perhaps there hasn't been some kind of Ukrainian counterattack in Donetsk, which did lead to the capture of the Zabalka, recapture of the Zabalka micro-district. But if so, this would be an ephemeral affair, as Zarubin is suggesting. And on the topic of Pokrovsk, Zarubin went on to say this is all information that ultimately derives, by the way, from Putin himself. Just to make that clear, Zarubin is speaking now after a discussion with Putin himself. The president told us about the recent military reports on the progress of the Russian advance. Battle Group Center, that is the force commanded by General Medvedev, which has just captured Selidovo, just saying, and Girnik. Battle Group Center has been successfully advancing in the Pokrovsk area for a long period, having got forward 5 to 6 kilometers over the past days. The pace is growing constantly, with the advance underway in the line spanning 23 kilometers. Again, I find it very difficult to make much sense of what they mean, what the Russians mean when they say that they're advancing 23 kilometers in one place and 15 kilometers in another, unless the Russians give us more precise information about where these advances have happened. I don't, to be honest, place a huge amount of value in this information. Anyway, Zarubin also talked to Zarubin about the fighting in the Siversk area. Now, interestingly, it doesn't mention Siversk itself, but this is what Putin said to Zarubin, according to Zarubin. Battle Group South have managed to move the Ukrainian army 20 kilometers away from Lysychansk. We've taken Belogorovka, Serebyanka, and Grigorovka, having advanced another 10 kilometers to the west from Belogorovka and liberated the settlement of Verkhonokamyanska. So according to Putin, and just to say, according to Putin himself, Verkhonokamyanska is under Russian control. Now remember, there was a lot of controversy about whether the Russians had indeed captured Verkhonokamyanska. Rybar said it was all a fake. Others agreed with him. Pictures appeared of FPV drones, the Russians FPV droning Ukrainian troops in Verkhonokamyansk. Of course, we don't know for sure when that film of the fighting in Verkhonokamyansk was made, and it is confirmed that the Russians control a major hill to the north of Verkhonokamyansk. But suffice to say that Zarubin is saying that Putin has told him that Verkhonokamyansk is indeed under Russian control. Now, I would have thought that it would be a very, very dangerous thing for the Russian military to lie to Putin, of all people, about such a matter, and for Putin to pass on that information to someone like Zarubin. So Putin apparently believes that Verkhonokamyansk is under Russian control, and I think we should take that extremely seriously. And then Zarubin tells us about Chasiv Yar. He said, President Putin has told us about recent military reports on the progress of the Russian advance. Our troops have reached the banks of the Seversky Donetsk Donbass Channel, that's the aqueduct, along the front of 16 kilometers, crossed the channel, having forced it. They're currently moving to the west. The 98th Airborne Division is currently fighting for the liberation of Chasiv Yar. In the settlement itself, we have moved 1.5 kilometers deep into it. Now that gives us no information that we didn't already know, but it does look as if, according to Putin, they are moving deeper into Chasiv Yar. And last but not least, we have from Zarubin his account of what's going on in the Ugledar area. Battle Group East is advancing after the fortified area was taken. The town of Ugledar, successful action in the northern direction continues as the battle group has advanced over 6 kilometers. And that is consistent with the reports we've just received about the fall of places like Bohoyavlenka, Shakhtarska, and Novoukrainka. So, a terrible day for the Ukrainian army. I've used that expression several times in the past. I think this has been one of the worst, actually. Well, all of this is happening. We still have that tantalizing story about the North Korean troops who are supposedly coming to fight in Kursk region or coming to fight somewhere. There's been an awful lot of discussion about this. Many people have, in my opinion, drawn far too much, put far too much value on certain comments that President Putin made over the course of a news conference, the news conference which he gave in Kazan. He was asked this question over the course of this news conference about the presence of the North Koreans, or alleged presence of the North Koreans. And it was asked by Keir Simmons from NBC News, an American journalist. Mr. President, satellite images are said to show North Korean troops are here in Russia. What are they doing here? And wouldn't that be a massive escalation in the Ukraine war? And then Putin spoke somewhat sarcastically. Images are a serious matter. If images exist, they indicate something. Now, that was taken by many people as confirmation of the story that North Korean troops are heading to fight with the Russians somewhere along the battlefronts, maybe in Kursk region, which is said to be, which many people are pointing out, is within the universally recognized international borders of Russia. It's been suggested that there would be a distinction made between the North Koreans fighting in Kursk region and the North Koreans fighting elsewhere in the area of the special military operation, because that would be in territory which is internationally recognized as Ukrainian and would mean that North Korea was an aggressor against Ukraine. Anyway, I don't think these words of Putin actually mean very much, because he then went on to say, and he was talking about the North Koreans specifically, that with regard to our relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, you may be aware that the Treaty on Strategic Partnership was ratified, I believe, just today. It is Article 4, and we have never doubted the fact that the DPRK leadership takes our agreements seriously. However, it is up to us to decide what we will do and how we're going to do it, and we will act in accordance with this article. We need to hold talks regarding the implementation of Article 4. However, we will be in contact with our North Korean friends to see how this process unfolds. So what Putin is saying is no decision has been made. there may be North Korean troops in Russia. He's not denying it. As I said already, it's possible that there are North Korean troops in Russia as on some sort of exercise process. But no decision, and this is, if you read it carefully, what he's clearly saying here, no decision has been made to deploy any North Korean troops who may be in Russia anywhere in a combat role so far. There've been no talks. We need to hold talks. And we will be in contact with our North Korean friends to see how this process unfolds. So there's no decision being made, no discussion. Putin, however, has been careful, noticing also not to completely rule out the possibility. There's been an awful lot of teasing and taunting by the Russians about this story. Russian troops have, for example, been waving North Korean flags at various places along the battlefronts. Presumably, they've been doing that under instructions. I'm not entirely sure what the Russians think they're going to achieve by all of this. But anyway, I remain not just skeptical, but exceedingly skeptical about this whole story. If you want a good written account of the immense problems, the colossal challenges of integrating a North Korean contingent into a Russian battlefield force, the best write-up I've seen of it so far is by Stephen Bryan in Asian Times. He's provided a very, very clear and detailed explanation of the extreme incompatibilities between these two militaries. It would probably take years of mutual training before these incompatibilities could be completely ruled out. Just saying. So, that story still floats around. There is another story that's floating around from the Russian side, and in fact from Marat Khairulin, who is one of Russia's most esteemed war correspondents, and he's a brilliant war correspondent, by the way. He is suggesting that the entire story, the whole North Korean soldier story, is a fake. And before I forgot, I should say that both the North Korean government and the Russian foreign ministry have denied this story. They said that it is, in fact, a fake. Just to say. Anyway, Khairulin says that it is a fake, but that it has been stirred up, that it has been fabricated, because following the complete failure of the training program for Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 aircraft, some active mind somewhere, has come up with the idea of substituting for those Ukrainian F-16 pilots, South Korean F-16 pilots, and that already a team of South Korean pilots has been sent to Romania, and it is they who will be flying the F-16s rather than the Ukrainian pilots who were supposed to be trained for them, and that the South Koreans have done this because of the reports about the presence of the North Korean troops fighting with the Russians, and that the whole story was in fact, the whole story of the North Koreans was in fact stirred up for no other purpose than to excuse the presence of the South Koreans flying the F-16s against the Russians. Well, all I will say is that may be true. It seems, again, incredibly complicated to me. As somebody who has quite a lot of contact with South Korea, my brother-in-law's wife is South Korean, just saying. I have to say that I think that such a move would be deeply unpopular in South Korean society, a factor which many people seem to find in the West, and indeed in Russia, may find difficult to imagine. But as I said, I think that this would be an extraordinarily reckless thing for the South Koreans to do. If the South Koreans start flying fighter jets to fight the Russians, first of all, if they're flying F-16s, they will be completely outmatched by the Russian Air Force. Not perhaps to the same degree that the Ukrainians would have been, but still, their fighter jets are not equal to the Russian fighter jets. And as we know, as we have now seen, Sukhoi 57 fifth generation Russian fighter jets are now active, increasingly active on the Ukrainian battlefronts, and will no doubt become more so as their numbers grow. So as I said, F-16s do not seem to me like a good match against fighters like the sort that the Russians have. Anyway, not only would it be a case of sending South Korean pilots to their deaths, but of course it will enrage the Russians. It will lead the Russians to accelerate whatever military relationship they're developing with the North Koreans. And of course, setting aside questions about North Korea receiving help in development of missiles and maybe nuclear bombs and things like that from the Russians. There's been a great deal of speculation about that over the years. What the Russians can also do is that they can change the military balance of the Korean Peninsula by providing the North Koreans also with advanced conventional weapons, especially and specifically in terms of North Korea's Air Force. North Korea's Air Force flies a very antiquated fighter jets. If they start receiving fighter jets like Sukhoi 35s and jets like that, well, it would be a problematic situation for the South Koreans. And if the Russians started to provide the North Koreans with submarine technology, it would be an even bigger problem. Of course, all of this violates UN sanctions. But, as we have seen, given the way in which the sanctions weapon has been massively overused by the West, and given the change in attitude towards North Korea, both by China and Russia, and given the fact that Russia itself is now exhaustively sanctioned already, including by South Korea, the Russians might say to themselves, well, it does violate UN sanctions, but let's do it anyway. It's not as if the West can do anything to us over and above that which it has already done. So just saying, if you wage the kind of sanctions war on Russia in the way that the West has done, then of course, especially if it fails, what you can find yourself with is a loss of leverage. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what we're looking at in relation to the relationship between Russia and North Korea. So anyway, there we go. I didn't want to spend more time about this. There's been quite a lot of discussion, again, about diplomacy and about diplomatic outcomes. And I think the first thing I want to say is that General Zaluzhny, who is now Ukraine's ambassador to Britain, not that he seems to be doing much in that respect, is now clearly, very, very clearly, positioning himself as the alternative to Zelensky, the man who is going to negotiate with the Russians, the man who is realistic and who is prepared to consider withdrawing or giving up the demand for return of Ukraine's eastern territories. General Zaluzhny has just made comments to this effect. He has also apparently made up with Zelensky's disillusioned and embittered former spin doctor, Alexei Arestovich. I've even seen a photograph of the two men together, though I don't know when that photograph was taken, and it might have been taken years ago for all I know. But anyway, there's even a photograph circulating of the two together, and it does seem as if the two have become somewhat unlikely political allies. By the way, if Zaluzhny is gravitating towards Arestovich, who I believe is based in New York nowadays, then it would suggest to me that Zaluzhny is also beginning to distance himself from the Kiev-based grouping of former President Poroshenko and Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko. Just to say, because as far as I'm aware, those two, Poroshenko and Klitschko, are strongly opposed to any surrender of territory to Russia at all, even on the most temporary basis. So, Zaluzhny is now undertaking these subterranean maneuvers, and he appears to be, as I said, making common cause with Arestovich. But of course, he's doing this from London as Ukraine's ambassador. I wonder how long he can remain Ukraine's ambassador whilst he's doing that. And I wonder also whether he's sensing that this is what the West wants, and that this is what he thinks is therefore that this positioning that he's taking isn't intended to appeal also to the West. He has, of course, his own problems. He has been named, including by Western officials, as the instigator of the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. And it's not impossible that a warrant in connection with that could at some time be issued against him. I'm not saying, by the way, that story, the whole story about him being the instigator of the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines is necessarily true. It might be a cover story, as many think, but the fact is that he has been named in that way. He must also, I suspect, have to take into account what his old friends in Ukraine, the radical militias who he previously supported and encouraged, what they would make of what I suspect they would see as a betrayal. But the fact that Zaluzhny is now making these moves suggests to me that he senses that over the last few weeks, especially after the disastrous unveiling of Zelensky's victory plan, there's been a general loss of confidence right across the West in Zelensky himself, matching the loss of confidence in Zelensky, which also exists in Kiev. Just to say. So anyway, we'll see what Zaluzhny is up to. Now, Zelensky himself has not been idle. He, for his part, as I discussed in a recent program, appears to have attempted to revive the proposal. It was always apparently a Ukrainian proposal, and it was never accepted by the Russians, for negotiations for a cessation of attacks on the various power systems in Russia and Ukraine, the mutual attacks on the two power systems, and also he mentioned a cessation of attacks on Ukrainian cargo vessels. Now, I've discussed recently how the Russians have recently begun attacking cargo ships steaming towards Odessa, cargo ships which they say carry weapons supplies for Ukraine. This has received zero coverage in the Western media, which I find extraordinary. But we see that Zelensky himself is alarmed about it. Anyway, Zelensky proposed negotiations along these lines in an interview in the Financial Times. And in Kazan, Putin said that over the course of his meeting with Erdogan had passed on to him a proposal from the Ukrainians for negotiations over some discrete question. And Putin said that it was about working out some new grain deal, though apparently talks on a mutual cessation of attacks on nuclear facilities, not, note, the entire respective energy systems. Talks for a cessation of attacks on nuclear facilities in Russia and in Ukraine might also be included. And Putin went on to say, well, yes, he's never opposed to talks. He told Erdogan, look, if you want to set up something with the Ukrainians, go ahead. We've never rejected talks on any topic. But then the moment that happened, the Ukrainians went silent. And Putin said that this has happened repeatedly. He complained, this is Putin, about the fact that the Ukrainians, in fact, are irrational, that they make proposals which make no sense, or that they make proposals which they never follow through, or they make proposals which appear to come to fruition in the way that the Istanbul Agreement almost came to fruition, and then they suddenly draw back from them. And he said that for all of these reasons, though he's never going to refuse to talk, he has no real confidence in any talks which do eventually take place. He has no confidence about the outcome. And of course, throughout the discussions in Kazan, Putin went back and repeatedly re-emphasized that for him now, the position is that the negotiating position he's taking is the one that he set out in June at the meeting of the Foreign Ministry Board, that the Russians are taking the whole topic of the status of the four regions off the agenda in any negotiations with the Ukrainians. As far as they're concerned, the four regions are Russia, and there's nothing more to be said about the matter. But they would be prepared to talk about the various other things, though the basis must be what was agreed in Istanbul back in April 2022. So that is what Putin is saying. Now, since Zelensky floated that idea of discussions about mutual cessation of attacks on energy systems and on cargo ships, we've heard nothing more about this proposal from the Ukrainians, and we've heard nothing more substantively about any kind of proposal at all. It is all very strange, and I wonder whether what might have happened is that Zelensky told Erdogan that he wanted to discuss a revival of the grain deal. He then told the Financial Times that he wanted to discuss the ending of a tax on merchant shipping in the Black Sea and a mutual attack on the two energy systems, which is beyond what he perhaps told Erdogan, and that he didn't like it when Putin said, well, all right, we're prepared to talk about that and about a cessation of attacks on nuclear power facilities. Because, of course, the Russians insist that they're not attacking Ukrainian nuclear power facilities. It is only the Ukrainians who are attacking nuclear power facilities, specifically the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and potentially they've been making threats and occasional attacks towards the Kursk nuclear power plant as well. Anyway, it was all very strange, but I have to say this. I saw no evidence of any real desire on Zelensky's part to conduct negotiations, and no sign of negotiations. Olaf Scholz, meanwhile, has come out publicly, apparently to the annoyance of the British. This is what the Daily Telegraph is saying, and has categorically ruled out an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO as set up in Zelensky's victory plan, and he's also categorically ruled out supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. He is taking this stance in the confident knowledge that German public opinion strongly backs him. So on that issue, and for that reason, Scholz, who's got pretty much nothing else working for him at the moment, is sticking to his position on this. I think that Scholz speaks for the silent majority of NATO member states. The Pentagon as well. I don't think they want to take on any of these extra commitments in the victory plan. But note, these are positions of refusal. They're negative positions. They're saying we won't agree to the victory plan. Scholz himself is supposed to have been working on some kind of peace proposal himself over the last couple of weeks. But surprise, surprise, we have heard nothing more about it. Meanwhile, in the United States, J.D. Vance, who is, of course, Donald Trump's partner in the race, he's now come forward and he's made another more comments about the situation in Ukraine, and they're very much along the lines of what he said before. They're perfectly correct as far as they go, which is that Ukraine is not going to win the war, that expecting that Ukraine can win the war is unrealistic, it is fanciful, that Ukraine needs to begin negotiations and needs to acknowledge that it is going to lose territory. Now, I may be misreading the situation, but my sense reading J.D. Vance's words, and I'm not suggesting here that he speaks for Donald Trump, by the way, but my own sense from reading J.D. Vance's words is that what Vance is saying to the Ukrainians is, look, we've done everything we can. We've helped you as far as it is possible for us to do. If we go on helping you further, we will, at worst, risk World War III, which we are simply not prepared to do on your behalf, or in the alternative, become even more over-invested in your cause, which it is not in our interests, and potentially deplete our own resources even further, which is emphatically not in our interests, given that we face other crises in the Middle East, in the Far East, and elsewhere. So, in your own interests, you need to start thinking seriously about opening negotiations with the Russians. We're not going to do it for you, but you should do it on your own. Now, I don't think that the Ukrainians will ever do it. I get to say that straight away. I've said already, and I've said this again, that the United States, if there's going to be a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, it is the United States and the United States alone that has the means to do that. Except maybe, if I'm reading Vance right, maybe his thinking is correct. That why should the United States use up time and political capital and diplomatic energy negotiating an end to the Ukrainian crisis when it's something that in theory the Ukrainians should be able to do for themselves. Ultimately, it is their country. The United States is not an ally of Ukraine. The Americans have lots of other things to think about. If you look at this from an absolutely tough-minded, calculated position, one based exclusively on American self-interest, you could say to the Ukrainians, look, we've done all we can. It's your turn. You've got to negotiate with the Russians now. We've got other fish to fry, very important ones for us. We are, after all, a global superpower. And we can't go on investing in you in the way that we have done up to this point. In which case, the United States could go ahead and start a new dialogue with Russia about important things like the security situation in Europe and about how to contain the aftermath of Ukraine's ultimate and inevitable defeat. It could also devote diplomatic energy to the problems that really matter for the United States, the crisis in the Middle East, the situation with Taiwan, other things of that kind. And the Ukrainians, of course, but also the Europeans, would be left hanging out to dry. Now, I am not a psephologist, an American psephologist about American elections. I don't know. I can't tell what the outcome of the elections is going to be, and I'm not going to make any kind of prediction in these programs. But what I will say is that there is, again, and I've often said this, I have a good nose for when I can smell panic. There is panic sweeping Europe that the next president of the United States will be Donald Trump, and the next vice president of the United States is going to be J.D. Vance, and that it is they who are going to come in and are going to assume control of the American government in January. And lo and behold, what do we read in the Financial Times? Panicky headline. It was the lead article in the Financial Times. EU races to prepare for a Trump win. Bloc seeks to bolster aid to Ukraine, sanctions against Russia and trade policy in case Republican is re-elected. And they're all, we're told that their EU capitals are racing to draw up assessments of the bloc's biggest vulnerabilities if Trump is re-elected. Senior EU officials are holding daily meetings to outline where a Trump presidency could cause the most pain for the bloc. The said topics under discussion include how to withstand a barrage of trade tariffs, offset an end to US aid to Ukraine, and maintain sanctions against Russia if Washington lifts its restrictions. And there are apparently preparations include formal talks between EU ambassadors and the staff of the European Commission, of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, as well as informal groups of senior EU diplomats considering possible strategies. And we learn, in my personal view, we will be in trouble, deep trouble, an EU diplomat said of a Trump win. This disruptive element will be huge, and the unpredictability will be huge. And we're told, and of course this is inevitable, the real worry, the major cause concern, is what will happen to the EU's beloved Ukraine project. The biggest short-term security concern of EU officials is how to continue support for Ukraine if Trump cuts off a flow of weapons that has played a vital role in helping Kiev thwart Russia's invasion. The EU has provided more financial support to Ukraine than the United States, but American weapons stockpiles and capabilities are far larger than European countries. Officials briefed on the discussion say there is no possibility EU militaries could match what the US is providing, which is absolutely true, by the way. And then we go on to read, officials in the bloc are also deeply concerned that a Trump administration would lift sanctions on Russia. That would raise the question of how much economic pressure the EU could maintain on Moscow without US support, even if Japan, the United Kingdom, and other allies kept sanctions in place. So panic is sweeping Europe. Panic because the situation on the battlefronts is disastrous. Of course, the Financial Times won't talk about that. Panic as the shadow of Donald Trump grows ever longer. And they say to themselves, my heavens, what shall we do? They're meeting in informal discussions. They're meeting in private discussions. The ambassadors of the EU member states are meeting anxiously with Ursula von der Leyen. Charles Michel is talking. Ursula herself is talking. They're all talking to each other. They say, how are we going to support Ukraine if Trump comes back? Well, I'm going to say it straightforwardly. They won't be able to support Ukraine if Trump comes in and does all of the things that they say they fear. If he really does cut off US military aid to Ukraine, if he really does lift sanctions against Russia, and it is important to say that this isn't something that he can do by himself. He would need support from Congress to do it. Perhaps if the Republicans sweep Congress, he might get it, but it is far from a done thing. But if the United States ceases military aid to Ukraine, if it ceases financial aid to Ukraine, then there is nothing that the EU can do to offset that, and we would be looking at an even faster collapse than the one we are seeing now. And if the United States goes ahead and lifts sanctions on Russia, well, Russia's trade with Europe was always much greater than Russia's trade was with the United States. This must be said. But realistically, are the Europeans, who are deeply divided now on this issue with each other, will countries like Spain and Italy, not to mention Hungary and Slovakia and Bulgaria and lots of others, will they really continue to support sanctions against Russia if the United States lifts them? The answer is, of course not. So they can huddle together, they can talk to each other, they can come up with all sorts of elaborate and clever plans, but none of them is worth a cup of tea. It really would. None of this is going to work. Now, on this topic, we're hearing all this, we're still hearing lots of things about the loan that the EU was going to put together. The $50 billion loan to Ukraine hasn't materialized. I've spoken about the many legal problems involved with that. The EU then was going to put problems with drawing on, using as security for that loan, the repayment vehicle for that loan, the interest from the frozen Russian assets. I said that this was way down with problems. So the EU was looking to create some alternative mechanism, to use some alternative mechanisms to float its own $40 billion loan, paid out of this mechanism via the EU member states. Ursula actually went to Kiev a few weeks ago and told Zelensky, don't worry, this loan is coming. The attempt to set up a mechanism was justified as circumventing the Hungarian veto. And I always said that this story of the Hungarian veto is the excuse that is always put up in advance of problems of this kind, to explain away problems with proposals like this, why they don't come immediately to fruition. In fact, what we're now hearing is that France and Germany have said no, that we cannot use some kind of alternative mechanism to provide Ukraine with a $40 billion, 35 billion euro loan. Doing so would compromise the integrity of that mechanism, and loans like this have to be approved by EU parliaments. It is as simple as that. And I suspect that if Germany were to participate in a loan project for Ukraine using a mechanism, the kind of complicated mechanism that Ursula has been discussing, there would be challenges to the German Constitutional Court, and there is a good possibility that the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe would veto it, would rule against the legality of doing it. So, the $50 billion loan is not crystallizing. The $40 billion EU loan, not crystallizing. Problems with the loans are mounting. There is still a fair chance, a good chance, that somehow, somewhere, in some way, they'll cobble up some money for Ukraine. I'm not sure how it will be done, but there's never any shortage of money in the West. That's the one thing the West always has. It can always produce money to sort out any problem. But it's not proving easy. I never thought it would. In fact, this is another terrible idea that is going to make even more problems going forward. And yet, look, we have problems with the loans. We have these murmurings from J.D. Vance. We have Zaluzhny undertaking all of his maneuvers. We have Scholz saying, no NATO entry for Ukraine. Nobody wants to talk to the Russians about Ukraine. Nobody wants to pick up the phone, speak to Putin, discuss this problem with him, see whether there might be any flexibility at all on his side. For the moment, it doesn't look like there is much, but you never know unless you speak to him. Nobody is doing that. In Kazan, Putin went out of his way to say that all reports, all claims that he refuses to take calls from Western leaders on any topic, that the Russians refuse to speak to the Western leaders or Western governments on any topics, are simply untrue. As far as the Russians are concerned, they are prepared to listen to any idea or any proposal that will be put to them. It doesn't follow that they will agree or that they will accept the idea proposed, but they have never shut the door on discussion. Putin said that he has made that point many times. Well, I'm sure he's right. But there it is. As I've said many times, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Stop holding these huddled meetings, people whispering and talking to each other, afraid of Donald Trump, afraid of a collapse near the Dnieper, all the chancelleries, all the governments in Europe in hushed discussions. We should have no more of these hushed discussions. It is high time that someone picked up the phone and talked. Jeffrey Sachs, by the way, has been saying this, well, for as long as we've been doing programs with him on the Duran, and I'm sure since long before. Well, will they do so? Will anyone do that? Not the current lot in Europe, not Scholz, not Macron, not Starmer, obviously, not Ursula either. I frankly cannot see the President of the United States, the current president, in the last weeks of his administration, reduced to a cipher, as I discussed in my program yesterday on so many issues, doing such a thing either. It will all depend on what the next president does. I hope that the president, as soon as he can, the new president, as soon as he can, prioritizes that call to Putin, even if he doesn't want to get too drawn into the negotiations about Ukraine, a wider negotiation with the Russians about security in Europe is imperative, and a discussion with the Russians about that might even in the end help with the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. Glenn Deason and I, by the way, did a very fine program with George Bieber, former top CIA person looking at Russian affairs, now working for Responsible Statecraft and the Quincy Institute and all sorts of other things, in which he made that very point. And he is obviously right. Let us reopen those channels of communication. Putin tells us that they are still there, behaving like spoiled children, sulking in a corner, is unbecoming, and it is wrong, and it is dangerous as well. Well, that's my program today. It's been all about Ukraine. Next, tomorrow, I'll return to the situation in the Middle East, where the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has said some very interesting and, in my opinion, rather worrying things, which make me wonder whether Iran might indeed now be reconsidering its position on nuclear weapons possession. But anyway, I will return to that topic tomorrow. In the meantime, this is my end of today's program. Let me remind you once again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Links under this video. You'll find all sorts of amazing things there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.